Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first podcast from Women for Biodiversity, where we want to give space to women's stories from different corners of the world. I'm your host, Sumina, and today we have a very special episode marking the completion of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence and also in the honor of Human Rights Day. We're privileged to be joined by a distinguished guest today, a force for change in the realm of human rights and indigenous advocacy in Nepal. Please join me in welcoming Nepali human rights lawyer Durga Mani Rai. As we navigate the intricacies of indigenous rights on this significant day, our conversation with Mr. Rai promises to be enlightening, shedding light on the challenges, triumphs, and the path forward. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's embark on this journey together. Without further ado, let's dive into this. Hello, Durga sir. Thank you so much for taking your time and sitting down for this podcast. Could you please give a short introduction about yourself?
It's really great to be with you. I'm Durga Mani Rai. I belong to Yampu indigenous community in eastern Nepal. And I'm working with LAHORNEP, that is the organization of indigenous lawyers that has been established in 1995. We work for indigenous people's right to self-determination and the fundamental freedoms. So we basically provide legal services to the affected indigenous communities, and we actively involved in the lawmaking process. Even we carry out our advocacy activities from grassroots to international levels.
In your work as a human rights lawyer, what are the unique challenges faced by the indigenous communities in Nepal? And what specific measures or policies do you believe are essential to address these challenges?
Yeah, we have a lot of human rights challenges that we have been experiencing here, right? First of all, what we have to understand is that right to self-determination is the fundamental requirement for indigenous people's democracy and development. That's why we are focusing on right to self-determination. I'm not going to talk about detail in right to self-determination from theoretical perspective or philosophical aspect. But what we have to understand is that some provisions are mentioned in the ILO Convention and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There are something that has established some standards how to ensure the indigenous people's right to self-determination, and rights are not actually implemented in the context of Nepal. Forced eviction, right to land, territories and resources, and special protected and autonomous things of indigenous peoples that had not been recognized. So I think these are the main challenges. The development aggressions are happening in the land territories of indigenous peoples that caused forced eviction from their traditional homelands. And then participation, the prior and informed consent, those are the basic mechanism of right to self-determination that has not been actually implemented in the context of Nepal. So we can consider that these are the major challenges that the indigenous peoples are experiencing in the context of Nepal. The second point that you have raised is what are the legal measures that can be we can consider to address the challenges. What we have experienced is that, as I mentioned before, the right to self-determination, for instance, autonomy, self-rule, right to land, territories and resources, that has to be recognized. When we talk about the Constitution of Nepal, that also has recognized some component of the right to self-determination. For instance, Article 56(5) of the Constitution of Nepal that says special protected and autonomous regions for indigenous peoples for socio-economic and cultural development, right? That constitutional provision. This provision is also reflected in the Local Government Operational Act in section 99 and 100 that says a special protected and autonomous region can be established, but those provinces are not implemented yet. Now, these are some areas that we are fighting for.
Thank you so much for that, Durga sir. I think we've touched upon this earlier in your introduction as well, where you've mentioned that indigenous communities and the Yamfu community that you belong to have your own distinct culture and practices. So my question would be, indigenous communities have these distinct cultural practices, right? But how can the legal framework be more inclusive and respectful of these indigenous perspectives?
The cultural rights of indigenous peoples is also linked to the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples, right? This is the one major component for indigenous peoples. As I mentioned that in the context of Nepal, as the constitution has mentioned that a special protected and autonomous region can be established for the socio-economic and cultural development of indigenous peoples, right? That provisions needs to be implemented, right? Autonomous regions that needs to be established, because our organization has filed a case in Supreme Court to establish that provisions. So we have won the case. The Supreme Court has issued directive order to establish cultural protected area of the Burma indigenous community, autonomy of the Burma indigenous community. And what we the indigenous peoples are saying that the autonomy, cultural autonomy, or special protected and autonomous region needs to be established to protect the cultural rights of indigenous peoples.
Right. Definitely agreed with you, Durga sir. Then that brings me to my next question of how do you see the intersectionality of indigenous rights and gender-based violence within the broader human rights landscape? As you already know, today marks the end of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and also today is Human Rights Day.
The indigenous peoples of Nepal, they are actually experiencing multidimensional violence or multidimensional discrimination against indigenous peoples, right, and indigenous community. Even the indigenous women, the racism is here, and we are culturally discriminated. Our participation, our autonomy, and those sort of things are not actually recognized by the Constitution of Nepal, right? So indigenous women, they are invisible in laws and policies, right? So if you look at the CEDAW recommendations that has made in 2018, that clearly recommended to the government of Nepal to recognize the indigenous women's identity and amend the constitutions respecting the self-determination of indigenous women, right? So indigenous women are facing multiple forms of discrimination and violence as a being indigenous women, as a woman, right? So as a being, it's like a general woman, so they are facing different or multidimensional violation, violence against women. So what we have to understand is that the level of violation is different. No, it's not like a general woman, so it has to be looked at differently. What I'm trying to say is that they have different type of violation and different that needs to be addressed differently. So that's my understanding.
You just mentioned that indigenous women are invisible in the eyes of the law. Why do you think that is?
So this is because the indigenous communities are experiencing centuries of discriminations. They're losing their territories, they're losing their identity, they're losing their self-determination. Even now they are exercising their own self-determination. They do have own self institutions, right, that can exercise the self-determination. So that has been curtailed, or that has been actually destroyed by the colonial state or colonial rulers in the context of Nepal. And the colonial rule is the main driving factor that the indigenous communities are excluded. Now, what I'm trying to say is that Because if you see that we do have one traditional government system, for instance, Tharu indigenous community, they do have a burgher system, which is the institutions that governs the whole community, right? And that has not been recognized by the government of Nepal. It means that they, Nepal is actually ruled by the Hindu fundamentalists. All the laws and policies are, actually derived from the Hindu philosophy and the Hindu jurisprudence. The indigenous knowledge system and the indigenous government system, indigenous, customary laws and practices, right? They have not been recognized and they are imposed, the other laws and policies. So this is what we call the colonial things that has been imposed to the indigenous community, and this is the main reason why indigenous peoples are getting discriminated, right? So we don't want that. We want our democracy in the sense that the indigenous own self-government system needs to be recognized. They are destroying our systems, they are destroying our territories, they are encroaching our lands, land and forest, and they are destroying our own system and practices. This is the colonial things that has been imposed by the Hindu state, right?
Yes, you've summarized it beautifully, Durga sir. So, in your experience as a male human rights lawyer, how can legal professionals actively engage with indigenous communities to ensure that legal frameworks not only protect but also respect the rights of indigenous communities and indigenous women?
Yeah, as an indigenous lawyer, what we have to understand is this, not like a general lawyer, right? The lawyers need to understand the indigenous law, indigenous worldview, because they need to go to the communities and they need to, the legal things are only technical things, but you need to understand what the indigenous philosophy are, what the mechanisms, indigenous mechanisms, that is self-determination, and you need to teach or you need to discuss. You don't have to teach, but the community already have that mechanisms and you need to tell them these are the mechanisms that have been recognized by the international law, even to some extent from the domestic law, right? This kind of things that we need to do, and then we need to mobilize the community. We need to orient the communities, right? But we have to make the communities themselves as a lawyer, and they have to advocate, for their rights. And even if the government is not actually ensuring the rights of indigenous peoples, they have the right to exercise their self-determination. They need to exercise the self-determination, right? So indigenous lawyer, the young lawyer, they need to, mobilize the communities from the indigenous perspective so that the community can defend their right, claim their right, and even exercise their right. So I think we need to have a different approach and different strategies how we can mobilize the communities. But the most important thing is that how they can exercise their right to self-determination by themselves is the key.
You've raised a very good point about indigenous communities having their own legal framework or legal mechanisms. How different are these frameworks or these systems, indigenous legal systems, versus the domestic law?
It's quite different. It's different because in the sense that in the indigenous legal system, right, there is no win, there is no loss. There is always a win-win system they do have, right? And then they don't have judges. All the communities are judges actually. They make very good judgment, it's very good. The system that can provide, justice to the communities, right? And they have very good systems and legal systems so that every indigenous community have easily access that legal systems, right? And it doesn't break the communities. Always win-win situation is there, and this very good system, the system needs to be recognized. That is the main point that we have been raising, because this is also one component of the indigenous people's right to self-determination, right?
That sounds awesome, actually. Would you be able to give an example of of what you're saying, because essentially what you're saying is that the indigenous legal system is more fair.
So if you look at the indigenous legal system of Tharo indigenous communities, they have a burgher system, and the burgher is the leaders, community leaders, and actually the community, when there is dispute happening in the communities and they come with a complaint to this indigenous leader, in these institutions, and they call the whole community people, and then they try to discuss and try to find the facts, and then they do the reconciliation, right? And it is a kind of really good mechanisms that can provide, the ensure justice to the communities. And this kind of very good system we have seen within the Tharo indigenous community, and that system has to some extent recognized by the local government, which is a good thing that is happening. And as of now, I think and 13 municipalities, they have recognized the system, right? So I think it is something good news for indigenous peoples.
It is definitely a good news. Anytime a state recognizes indigenous knowledge, tradition is always a good news for the community. However, aside from that, what broader societal change do you believe are necessary to ensure the safety and well-being of indigenous women or women in general overall?
When it comes to broader sense, but it needs broad societal changes, right? It means that all the segment of the society needs to understand the basic human rights, right? So I think that campaign and the awareness building activities, even from, not only in the indigenous community and even the outsider, they need to understand about the indigenous right. They should have common understanding what the indigenous people's rights are, and this kind of massive campaign or massive awareness building activities needs to be carried out, and all segment of the society needs to understand about the human rights, right? So they need to respect each other. So I think these are the broader changes we need to bring, right?
Right. Societal awareness about indigenous rights and cultural practices always goes a long way, and in fact it is also one of the key focus for Women for Biodiversity as well, the work that we do. Moving on, today is Human Rights Day. Today is December 10th. Can you share a specific case that you dealt with which was a major win for an indigenous community?
As a human rights lawyer and as a human rights organization, we have been, carrying out indigenous people's human rights campaign across the country. And then, as I mentioned before, our campaign is right to self-determination, which is our core focus. And then we have done a lot of things, actually, as I shared the case about the legal recognition of the traditional governance system of Tharo indigenous peoples, right? This is also, we can consider the major win, and that's very recent. It happened in 2021, and as of now, as I mentioned, 13 municipalities have already brought the law that has recognized the indigenous customary, self-government institutions, and this is, we can consider a major win. And the second example that I want to make is the Kirtipu Rural Municipality. This is also in 2021, right? And then there's the Kirtipu Rural Municipality has brought new law that has established cultural protected area, defining the certain indigenous territory, and the indigenous traditional institutions, what we call is Guri system. And they are the one who govern their territories, right? Guti system is a traditional institutions of Newa indigenous peoples, and the Gutis are the responsible actually to govern their cultural territories. It means that the outsiders can do nothing without the consent of their traditional governance system, and which is what we can call a kind of autonomy, cultural autonomy they are exercising, right? I think this is something very important achievement we have made as of now. Now some Tamang indigenous communities in Sankarapur rural municipalities and even in Morong district, the Santhal indigenous communities, they are demanding the recognition of their own traditional governance system. The local government of Katari rural municipality has, they are now developing laws to recognize their traditional governance system. So I think this is something important for indigenous peoples to promote their own autonomy. Yeah, that's a minimum level of self-determination, what we call, and then we are not satisfied, but at least we have to work a lot.
Definitely. There is a lot of work to be done, and the struggle is very much alive. But you've been in this, you've been fighting for Indigenous rights for the past 20 years now. So what keeps your passion alive even after all of these years?
So I have a long history actually, because I was engaged in indigenous movement from the beginning, because I was the vice chairperson of my own indigenous community, and I have been involved in identity movement, right? And then gradually I understand what the indigenous people's rights are, and even I have attended in different international forums, even the UN forums, business and human rights forums, and different forums I have been involved, and then I understand what the indigenous people's rights are, and I feel the discrimination against my people, and then I'm very much inspired how I can work to protect the human rights of indigenous peoples, right?
That is beautiful to hear, Durga sir. We are nearing towards the end of the podcast now. So I just have one last question before you leave. If you have to give one piece of advice for young advocates and activists, what would that be?
So I prefer indigenous lawyers or any other lawyers. You don't have to have your only bookish knowledge. You should learn about indigenous knowledge, indigenous judicial systems, indigenous philosophy, indigenous worldview, right? And you must have the spiritual understanding of indigenous peoples, right? So then you can learn from the indigenous community. So they are the knowledge holder, and you can learn legal systems, democracy, development, everything. Indigenous peoples are the source of democracy. That's why you learn the indigenous juridical system, indigenous jurisprudence, and you feel the discrimination against indigenous peoples. And you learn the law, international law, Nepali law, and the customary law. And then you do the advocacy and you do the lawyering, indigenous lawyering, community lawyering, and you go to the community people and you tell them what the indigenous people's rights are, which are recognized nationally or internationally. At least UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this is the minimum standard to implement or to respect the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. The one thing I want to say lastly is that many indigenous lawyers, even the activists, don't understand the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? Because you are exercising UNDRIP. So you need to exercise your right. That is the exercise of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
And with that, we've come to the end of the podcast. That's it for today, folks. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed speaking with Durga sir. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to write to communications@womenforbiodiversity.org. That's number 4 instead of FOR. Until next time, stay strong and carry on.